Okay, folks. Since I've got, okay, please. Since I've gotten a couple of details from you, we are. I spent the most time with Engels, okay, because it's kind of the foundational ideas of this socialism, and then various people like Kautsky work off him or criticize him, like Bernstein, and that goes on throughout the literature. So there's no question you'll have, and this is what you're going to ask me. Yes, you will have a question on Mr. Engels. That'll be mandatory. You'll have to answer the question that's asked, but then you'll have choices. So we're going to finish Bernstein. We'll finish Bernstein, and then I will do. Okay. Sorry. We'll finish Bernstein. Get some a little bit of Marx. Engels is obviously Kautsky, Bernstein. Then I'm going to jump into reading their, I think it's on part B, class theory of society, because it'll be a useful summary. And just before I do class theory, I'll do Lenin. So I hope to do a little bit of Lenin today and next week. And then the last theorist we're going to do, so the way we're reading, is this guy, Nove, N-O-V-E, very famous man. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. And you'll see why. He's not a Marxist at all. Okay. I had a question after the lecture, a good question, and so I'd like to share the question with you and the answer. Exactly what is the difference between this humanism and structuralism? I had hoped that you would run into this in other courses, but evidently some of you have not, in terms of what I've been told. Bernstein, just to remind you, was a humanist, and he was reacting against the structuralism of Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky. Okay. Humanism, no one knows who invented it. Humanism and structuralism are two radically different ways of making sense of society. That's what they are. They are theories of society. And they are in a variety of different fields, not just economics, that have political science, you run into anthropology, very famous in anthropology, sociology, history. Humanism was born, not terribly surprising, in the Renaissance. So humanism is born in the idea that human beings have control over their lives. Our destiny is what we make of it, to put it in the simplest terms possible. So it was an idea that the success, or lack thereof, of any individual was up to that individual him herself. It's a brilliant idea in the Renaissance. It wasn't God's will, it wasn't the church, it wasn't the Lord, but rather your success, or lack thereof, was due to your own actions. That's Adam Smith. That's individualism. That's what humanism means. The individual is what counts. So the theorization of society began to take place from the perspective of the individual. I mentioned this to you before. Let me do it again. Neoclassical, classical, and then neoclassical theory. So Adam Smith and the people that followed him, the idea was you let each individual act in his or her own self-interest. If you establish private property in competitive markets, if the individuals establish those two institutions, property and markets, competitive markets, then each and every individual will be led as if by an invisible hand maximum wealth that that person is capable of achieving. That is a grand idea. Coming out of the Renaissance. Coming out of the death of feudalism is this new idea. You can see the birth of capitalism for hundreds of years is the birth of this humanism. And it's not just in economics, it's in art as well. You visit the great museums in Europe or elsewhere, East and Western Europe, and you can see the fantastic celebration of the human being in terms of the drawing the man, the woman, and so forth. It's a feast of individuality. And all the beauty of it, and the sculpture, and the music, Beethoven, the great humanist, Mozart. But that's why I thought you might get this in other courses. Then there's another theory. This theory, we actually can put a label on it, who kind of came up with it first. Structuralism. The guy's name was Levi Strauss. He was an anthropologist. Most famous anthropologist that ever lived, probably. Levi Strauss. And he had the following, or structuralism in general, had the following very different idea, which is what we do, our behaviors, doesn't rest in our genes, that's humanism. But rather, it rests in hidden rules and laws that govern us. And we as individuals, our behavior conforms to those laws. For Levi Strauss, it was language. So what we do in a society conforms to the languages that we produce as a society. That's how we interact with one another, how we understand one another, how we speak to one another, blah, blah, blah. So if you don't want to understand a society, what people do, you study its languages. You can see why the anthropologists would be interested in this. In economics, Adam Smith, the great humanist, the great structuralist, it comes along in the 1930s. That's Keynes. So Keynes says, look, our behavior conforms to certain structural rules. And if you understand how capitalism works, you have to understand those rules. Don't look to the individual, look to these structures. So in economics, 104, 204, you look to a particular kind of rule, which is C. You look to the marginal propensity to consume. So if this is 0.9, for every extra dollar you get, your extra consumption is 90 cents. Okay? So where does that come from? That's a rule of the structure. So everybody conforms on the average to this rule. So if you want to understand society, you have to understand that you're writing out a structural equation and that coefficient which drives the society. That's if you want, a law of the structure, or rule of the structure. Versus macroeconomics, microeconomics. Very quickly, since it's not this course, what do we consume? What do we demand? So here's what we demand here. This is our demand for consumption as a product of the rule of society. And everybody conforms to this. Don't look at the individual. You look at the overall structure. That's the language of society. Here, instead, for each and every individual, as you all learned it, this is what we consume. We consume this amount of 2. We consume this amount of 2 for each individual in society. Look at this stuff. Individual preferences, individual budget line, the tangency, as you all learned, that's the optimal condition. That's the amount that each one consumes, that each person consumes of 2 and 1, and then you add them all up, and you get the big demand, what we call it, the big D of consumption. You get the same consumption demand. You notice there's 2 different theories here. This says start with the part, add up the parts, get the totality. This one says start with the totality and you know the parts. You deduce the part from the totality. Here, you start with the part and you deduce the totality. Two different ways of viewing the world. Okay? Kautsky and Engels were structuralists. They said if you want to understand capitalism, in fact, Engels says if you want to understand any society, feudalism, whatever it was, if you want to understand capitalism, you have to understand its structure, its operating structure, which comprises what? The forces and the relations of production. The mode of production determines our individual behavior. Our thinking, our music, our art, our markets, they're derivative. They're derived from the mode of production. The mode of production is the ultimate cause. Now, he's not a Keynesian. I understand it. And Keynes is not a Marxist. But they're deploying a similar kind of methodology. Bernstein, who's no neoclassical theorist, is coming back and saying, no, there's no role for the human agent here. You're deriving what an agent does from this structure. I think that a society, and I think that socialism, a society operates, capitalism operates, and socialism operates, by each individually, if you want each individual taming the society. We're not just functions of the society, we can determine the society. That's been a debate in social theory, not just in economics, for hundreds of years. So, Mr. Bernstein is arguing here that the choices of free individuals, the choices of each individual operating in a parliamentary democracy, the importance of democracy for him, can shape everything in society, including the mode of production. So he's giving a new emphasis to a causal agent, which is the human being, which you very rarely find in Engels and Kautsky. And, of course, for Bernstein, there are no inevitable laws of the structure operating in individuals, as there were in Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky. There's no contradiction between the relations and forces of production that I taught you and that you read that's operating on everybody in society. No inevitability for that contradiction between relations and forces to produce socialism, as Kautsky claims. So socialism doesn't necessarily arise out of this contradiction between the relations and forces of production that these people argue. In fact, says Bernstein, let me pick it up. Capitalism presented the space for reforms, for individuals to struggle in capitalism through the state, through democracy, to reform it, to reduce inequalities. That's the importance of democracy, and it's the reforms. Through factory reforms, universal suffrage, which I mentioned to you, welfare reforms, and even progressive taxation, tax reforms. All of those reforms, which radically alter capitalism, according to Bernstein, in a progressive way, to build towards socialism, are a result of individuals striving to change the society in which they live. So you get a debate, again, that I introduced you to in the first lecture, between the reformers, the followers of Bernstein, and the revolutionaries, the followers of Engels and Kautsky. And then you're going to see a big revolutionaries coming up, Mr. Lenin. So, for Bernstein, the state is not just an instrument of the capitalists. The people who, relations of production, the people who own the means of production will find one way or the other to capture the state and use it to do what they want, which is to maintain their property, to maintain their private markets, to exploit people, blah, blah, blah. Bernstein says, no, the state is not just the arm of the capitalists, which will be deployed by the capitalists to screw everybody, to put in crude terms. But for Bernstein, he says, no, the workers themselves through their unions, through their representatives, can work inside the state to use the state to reform the worst excesses of capitalism. Two different views. Okay? Then Bernstein goes to work, it's like different global view. He goes to work on the details of Mr. Kautsky. These criticisms that he's going to mount of Kautsky are very, very important, as you're going to see. Some of you have raised them already, both in emails and in class. Bernstein attacks three important arguments, three theses of Mr. Kautsky. Number one, he says, I don't agree that there's been an increased centralization of capital ownership in fewer and fewer hands. I don't agree with that. Kautsky has this image that more and more of the ownership of the means of production is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Bernstein says, no, I don't agree with that. Second, I don't agree that there's a polarization of society into two jumbo classes. The people who sell their labor power and the people who buy it. The workers and the capitalists. I don't agree with that. And third, I don't agree with the crisis potential of capitalism. I don't think it's inevitable that we get crises. So let's explore his criticisms here. First, let's take the second part of this concentration of ownership of capital in fewer and fewer hands. Bernstein, in the early part of the 20th century, he sees something that actually develops after his death, much more than that developed. He kind of gets a glimpse into it, which is the ownership of capital, means of production, becomes dispersed across society. It's not just a few who own the means of production. Why? Because sheer ownership of these larger corporations is in the hands of many individuals, many of them being workers through their unions. So Bernstein gets a glimpse into the future. But the future is now. And now is that it's not just a few capitalists that own these corporations, but rather the ownership through 401 plans and stock and pensions and so forth is dispersed across many hands. It's kind of a democratization of ownership. Second part of this. Second part is even not more interesting, but okay, it's as interesting, the second part of this. Kautsky has the idea that as competition occurs, so don't miss it on this first exam, competition is the struggle over that super profit, that surplus value amongst these competing capitalists. That's what I taught you. Okay? And don't remember how it worked. If the capitalists didn't keep up with the struggle, raising their productivity, lowering their average cost, they'd be driven out of business. Kautsky has the image that this competition is going to end up with just a few capitalists remaining. Those few capitalists, the kind of the giant sharks, are going to eat all the little sharks. They're going to kill them, wipe them out. That's what sharks do to one of them. And so we're going to end up in industry after industry with just a few corporations who have driven out of business those capitalists who are unable to compete. They will die. Put it in modern lingo. Kautsky has the image, much more than that, that what we're going to end up with is monopoly capitalism. Because the few firms that are going to remain are now going to have the power to set the price. Go back to your micro theory. The demand curve is no longer going to be perfectly elastic for these producers. It's going to be now some that has less than perfect elasticity, and there's going to be a marginal revenue curve. So out of competition, we're going to arise monopoly power in which these firms now have the power to set the price independent of the market. And they're going to be giant firms. Monopoly capitalism emerges out of competitive capitalism. Bernstein comes back and he says, no, I think competition is much more sophisticated and nuanced than you're claiming. What I think is that there's always new kinds of competition within industries and across industries. Now, he does not explore it as much as he should. So let me recast his argument in my own terms. What Bernstein is, in a sense, arguing here is that these very giant firms that arise with these enormous profits, these monopolies, they take a portion of their surplus and they use it to develop new products and go into new industries. Number one. Number two, there's always new kinds of inventions occurring for all kinds of complicated reasons. And these new kinds of inventions and so forth, they create new firms and new forms of competition. Let's take two nowadays. One the present, one the future. First, the present. Just a couple of years ago, I think, it seems to me just a couple of years ago, the biggest maker of these wireless phones, or one of the biggest makers, this company in Norway, Nokia. So Nokia was a major producer of these phones for all the different, AT&T, Verizon, and so forth. It was had a monopoly position. Today, it's being threatened with losing that entire business. Because of these new kinds of phones that have been invented and so forth, and the new producers, that which was a monopoly position for Nokia just a couple of years ago is now a position that is being completely threatened by Apple and so forth, etc., all these new phones that are coming out and all these new systems all over it. Google, blah, blah, blah. And many of these new companies, like Apple, are going into the wireless phone business. Same thing with computers. So in industry after industry after industry, new competitors arise, which attack these monopoly positions, whether it be in pharmaceuticals, or phones, or television sets, or automobiles, and so forth. Let's take a future one. It's easy to talk about the future since we have no idea what's going to happen. Let me give you another one. Let me give you another one that may happen in the future. Because people now are writing about it, talking about it, you'll be intrigued, or some of you will be intrigued with this. What may come in the future, and which may enhance competition in a way that has not been enhanced since the Great Industrial Revolution in 1750, is what people talk about, engineers call 3D manufacturing. You heard of this? 3D manufacturing, three-dimensional manufacturing. Very briefly, since I don't understand it. You take a blueprint, a schematic. You put it on your computer. You download it to your computer. Load it to your computer. Then you download that blueprint to another machine, another computer, and that other computer manufactures that particular product. It's science fiction. No, it's being done today. So airplane wings, gloves, violins, medical instruments, 1,000 different things are being manufactured today through this kind of 3D manufacturing. What that implies is that you, me, anybody could have two of these machines and we could become capitalists, producing these products in a small office, in our homes, wherever, so long as you have the technology of a computer plus this other machine that makes this image into a particular product. The way it does it is very interesting. That's what I don't understand, is through these complicated lasers which fuse together the product to eventually produce the wing of an airplane. If it's a wing of an airplane, you need a big building. If it's a baseball glove, you don't need one. But just think of how competition would be enhanced, in which potentially everybody could be a manufacturer. There's a magazine called Economist. It comes out of Britain. They have, in the new issue, they have an article on 3D manufacturing. There's also, if you go to MIT, Massachusetts Technology, you'll find discussions there of 3D technology. That's for your future and your kids' future. But you get the idea that that's an attack upon Mr. Kautsky's image of monopoly capitalism. That's a different way of competitive capitalism to rise and become even stronger. Second, the first point. Second point on this. He says, look, says Bernstein, I agree that capitalism produces crises. I agree with that. But I also think that capitalism is continually producing ways to deal with these crises. This has come up several times in the course. So he doesn't deny the crisis potentiality of capitalism, but what he adds to it, unlike Kautsky, is that there can be reforms of capitalism which deal with these crises. The most important being, which we mentioned many times in this course, and we started the course with, is of course payments. The state itself can intervene through its expenditure and its taxes to try and offset the worst excesses of the crisis. That's what was done under Bush, the last term of Bush, and under the first few years of Obama. And what's been done by almost every president in the United States, once they became conscious of this kind of Keynesian policy, starting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They've all done it, from one to the other. So the state becomes an instrument of reform to try and deal with the worst excesses of the crisis. You don't really get that in Kautsky and in Engels. Also, what we mentioned last time, Bernstein has a different notion of the market. He says, look, it's not just that the state can intervene, but also the market itself acts to stabilize itself through that invisible medium. That's what you mentioned. That's Mr. Bernstein. So if every time there's an excess supply of cars, the price of cars falls, which stimulates people buying cars. If there's an excess demand for beer, the price of beer rises, which produces that excess demand. So the excess supply and demand of the product help to change the prices, which helps to deal with the problem in the first place. Last one, okay, in terms of this argument, this polarization of society, into these two giant classes. He says, new classes are appearing in capitalism. It's not just, it's not merely the people who produce the surplus and the people who appropriate the surplus. It's not just that. But we have new kinds of classes that are emerging. He doesn't say this, but we can say this. The middle classes. It's not just a two-class society. But we also have to take into account, do what we did now, we take into account not just the people who produce the surplus in capitalism, but we have here, the producers of the surplus. I have no idea what, let's say 49.5% of our labor force. We have the people who appropriate the surplus, say 1% of the labor force. But we also have everybody on the right-hand side of the equation. All these different, we read them out. We have the managers, owners, bankers, the state officials, merchants, lawyers, and so we have another 49% of the population. So these people demand goods and services, for sure. These people don't demand much, it's 1%. And what's in here is, homes, you have 6, 7 homes. It's still not going to exhaust everything that's being produced. How many Jaguars can be purchased? But over here, you have another enormous demand for all the consumer goods that are being produced. And you, Kautsky, you miss the right side. You miss all these different classes that have arisen who have the income, the cut of the surplus, to purchase all these goods and services. So you miss 49.5% of the population. these are the new middle classes. So for Bernstein, to sum all this up, socialism, he's still a socialist, as I told you, becomes something radically different than what it was for Engels and what it was for what it is for Kelsen. It's something, for those other characters, socialism was, if you remember now, collective ownership of the means of production and planning. Collective ownership of the means of production and planning. Bernstein is already arguing that there is collective ownership. That's what he means by the widespread ownership by the workers. That's happening. You don't need a revolution over that. We already have this kind of democratic ownership across society. More and more people own the means of production. It's not concentrated just in the hands of this 1%. It's over here and it's over here. So you're already getting that, this democratization of ownership. So capitalism accomplishes that kind of socialism. For Bernstein, then, what is socialism? It is really an extension of democracy. That's really what he has in mind. So for him, we have a new kind of meaning of socialism arising in his work and the work that follows it, which is how is power distributed in society? A socialist society is one in which you get socialized production. That's already accomplished. That's the forces of production that's been accomplished by these capitalist firms. He agrees with Engels and Bernstein on that. That's what capitalism does. And that's progressive. You get all that. But the problem with capitalism is that it's controlled by a few individuals in society who receive the surplus, and the workers have no say on who controls the use of the means of production. Yes, it's collectively owned, but the workers have no say on how those means of production that they own are used. The workers have no say on the length of the workday, no say on their wages, no say on their work conditions, and hence socialism for him is not accomplished merely by a collectivization of the ownership and by planning. What is also required is that the workers be in a position to control their work life. To control their work life. And to control the use of these means of production. Socialism, quote, socialized ownership under conditions of democracy for and by individuals. In some ways, he takes, the notion of American democracy and he extends it to the workplace. I'm sorry, sir. In some sense, he takes the American notion of political democracy, the right to vote, and he extends it to the workplace, to the factory, and the office. So, workers may own the means of production, he makes that argument, but they don't have control of that which they own. Here's an easy illustration of that. Individuals may own an individual could be a multimillionaire and be 2 years old. So your parents, unfortunately, pass away and they leave you an enormous estate. But you're a minor, and so the court or the will appoint somebody to control that wealth. So you own legally as a minor, but you have no control over that which you own. That's what he's arguing. So legal ownership is only one aspect of this for workers. They must also control that which they own. Socialism, then, for Mr. Bernstein, will be produced by each and every human being, he's a humanist, by their arguments, reason, by their moral striving, for what? For democracy, for freedom, to liberate them from oppression and control by these 1%. Housing. Socialism will be produced by a revolutionary agent, a class of the proletariat, who seize state power, not by reason or election, by revolution, nationalize property, nationalize markets. So it's going to call for a revolution against capitalism compared to Bernstein's reform of capitalism in instituting political change in a society. The present. The present is a little bit of an extension of these two gentlemen in Europe. Not in the States, not in the United States, but in Western and Eastern Europe. What we have there is democratic socialism, sometimes called market socialism. So you have a little bit of Kautsky's heritage. People there, the parties, the socialist parties in Germany, and France, Italy, and so forth, Poland, they argue for the socialized ownership of the means of production. Kautsky. And that's supposed to eliminate the worst excesses of capitalism, which is too much wealth going to too few individuals. So socialize the ownership. But they combine that with Bernstein's heritage, which is the freedom of individuals to buy and sell in a market. Freedom of individuals to produce goods and services and to buy and sell goods and services in a competitive market. But then, of course, if you have competition, you may have the business cycle, but it's not being planning anymore. And therefore, they say that Mr. Keynes should come in to control the worst excesses of the business cycle. So this democratic socialism is kind of a socialist pancake, I don't know how to describe it, which combines together these three ingredients, which are Kautsky's and Engels' collectivization of the means of production, Bernstein's notion of democracy for the workers in terms of the introduces for the market, and then of course Mr. Keynes to control the worst excesses of the market. And that exists today in Western Europe. Okay, that's Mr. Bernstein. We're going to come back to his ideas as we will to these other two, but you can see this is very different. Despite the fact he was a socialist, as I told you all his life, very different than the socialisms presented by these two other guys. So this is sometimes called a revisionism. He's a revisionist theory. He's attempting to revise Marx and Engels and Kautsky. And of course they struggled. In Europe, they struggled with each other. And they said nasty things to one another. Who was the true followers of Marx and Engels? The next one, V.I. Lenin, L-E-N-I.
Could you say the three parts of that pancake again?
I'm sorry?
Can you repeat the three parts of that pancake?
Okay.
What was collected?
Okay, yeah, socialist pancake. Sounds nice. It has three ingredients. It has the heritage of Bernstein, which is this democracy, the freedom of each individual to produce wealth in the market, and in turn, the freedom of each individual to buy that product in the market. So we ought to be ruled by competitive markets, supply and demand. So that doesn't allow power to be concentrated in few hands. He likes that. Number one. Number two, he also, in this democratic socialism of Europe, they also like the idea of Engels and Kautsky, which is this nationalization or collectivization of the means of production. Here they argue, means of production or certain kinds of means of production should be collectivized, nationalized. What that means is, I'll give you an example later on in the course, when you're born, you become an owner of the means of production. I'm going to describe to you how that might occur. So you're given not just a birth certificate, and not just a social security card, but you're given a certificate that says you are a partial owner of the means of production of society. So that gets rid of the worst excesses of much of the wealth owned by too few and the power associated with it. Third, if you introduce markets, you always have the problem of the excesses, the ups and downs, the booms and busts of markets, So these democratic socialists in Europe say, well, then the state has an important role to play in trying to control, manage the business cycle. So that's your three ingredients, okay, of democratic socialism, or sometimes called market socialism. Yes, sir.
In Bernstein's
You do a little up, yeah.
sorry, in Bernstein's democratic socialism, there's a way for there to be collective ownership, like Kautsky, and there's also a way for there to be a freedom to produce wealth. There's also like freedom for individuals to produce their own wealth as well. Some of those.
So what are you asking? That's correct what you said.
How does that work? I don't know. Maybe I'll just keep listening. Maybe I'll pick it up.
How does it work to make a pancake?
No, how is there collective ownership and the individual's rights to produce?
Okay. You ready?
Yes.
I'm going to do it later on, but since you asked, I have a problem. You can criticize me, which is that I tend to respond to the question of the time. And perhaps I shouldn't, but I've always have. So I'm going to do it. Okay, because you're recording. And after class, I want you to give me $25. These are two different things. To produce this code is one thing. But to own the materials and the machines to produce the code, those are two different things. Now you can combine them together, they're two different things. So is it possible, human beings are geniuses at doing these things, is it possible to combine them together under different kinds of legal arrangements? Yes. So we can set up a society in which everybody owns the mechanisms, the means by which we produce codes. And then the people who produce codes, they have to gain access to those means of production so they can produce a code. Because they're owned by somebody else. They're owned by everybody in society. Okay. So, you can pass a rule or a law or a market which says, as a producer of the codes, I need tools and thread and so forth, etc. And so I'm going to have to take a cut of my profits and distribute it to the collective owners to gain access to the means of production. Okay. Mr. Lenin, okay? Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 1870 to 1924. Called for short V.I. Lenin. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He was born in Russia. He went to the University of St. Petersburg. And he entered politics in 1893, before the turn of the century. And he organized a Marxist party in Russia. Russia's ruled by the Tsars. He's arrested in 1895, not surprisingly. He leaves Russia in 1900. And he returns. So what happens to him? He becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. He becomes the first premier of the Soviet Union. And he dies, as I said, in 1924 of an aneurysm. So he becomes premier in 1917, just a few years later, 7 years later, he's dead. And Stalin takes over. And he is the leader of what is called the Bolshevik Party, a revolutionary Marxist party in Russia that makes the 1917 revolution, out of which comes the Soviet Union. So, he's kicked out of Russia, he leaves Russia in 1900, and he returns to Russia some years later. During World War I, he's returned to Russia by the Germans. To remind you, remember Germany and Russia were at war with one another during World War I. So there's the Eastern Front in which the German armies have invaded. They're invading now Russia. before the revolution, so Russia's still being ruled by the Tsar's family, and the landed aristocracy there. And the Germans take Mr. Lenin, you know where he is, they take him and they put him on a train in Poland, if I remember correctly. They seal the train and they send him into Russia where they release him. There's a famous movie on it. Why? Why? Yeah,
Trying sort of the power in Russia.
that's right. The reason they do this is what these two guys just said. They have read, the Germans, what Mr. Lenin has written. They've read this stuff. They understand that this man is a revolutionary who wants to get rid of the Tsar and institute communism, socialism in Russia, which will get Russia out of the war. Yes, they send in the person who's the most important person at that time on the Eastern Front, who's an enemy of capitalism in Germany, but is also, more than that, an enemy of capitalism and the rulers in Russia at the time. So they hope, they win that, they're right on that sending in this character, releasing him, he's going to create a revolution, or help to create a revolution in Russia, and the Russians indeed stop fighting in that war, before the war's over. Yeah?
And Lenin just went along with this?
I wasn't clear enough. Lenin wanted more than anything else to get rid of exploitation in this vast country, Russia, in which there's a ruthless kind of exploitation under the sun. Desperate poverty.
So we didn't care that the Germans were using it in their own ways.
I'm sure that bothered him to a degree. But they were bigger fish to fry, which was to win a revolution in one of the most important countries in the world. In capitalism, so this is his very famous one of his famous contributions to his view of the state. Okay? So he's coming later now. He's coming after Mr. Engels. He's coming after Kautsky. He's coming, and he's a Russian. He's coming after these Germans. So this is the beginning of a kind of viewpoint of what is Marxism from the Russian perspective. So far we've had the German, and we've had also the French and the Italian, but now it's coming this Russian, under the first great theorist, Mr. Lenin. He says in capitalism, the state is an instrument used by the capitalists to create and maintain the conditions of capitalist exploitation. Right. But a whole bunch of stuff. Private property, labor market, money, transport, police, welfare, education, trade restrictions, and so forth. That's why these arguments are interesting. He's turning Bernstein on his head. He's saying, doesn't say, but he's saying in a way, the very reforms you think Bernstein will produce socialism, no way. They are ways for a clever state to pacify workers and to keep class exploitation in place. An argument here between these characters. Exploitation is not going to end if workers get this kind of democracy. It's only when the workers use their power to get rid of the left-hand side of the equation. But they're not going to do that because the state is continually going to mystify them and control them and discipline so they don't use their power to get rid of that. That's Mr. Lenin. So, the capitalist state for Mr. Lenin is but a political and economic and cultural form of class exploitation. It's an instrument of the capitalist class. He falls into, or he embraces, economic determinism, just as Engels and Bernstein. What he's saying here is that the state politics of the state, the culture of the state, so forth, etc., is merely an arm, an extension of the capitalist class to suppress the to suppress the proletariat when necessary, to mystify the proletariat always, to facilitate exploitation eventually. So the state is just a reflection of what how the capitalists wield their economic and political and cultural power in society. In socialism, the state is seized by the proletariat and used to do what? To suppress the capitalists. Because in capitalism, the state is used to suppress the workers. What you got to do, according to him, is the workers have to rise up in a revolution, seize the state, and use it to suppress the capitalists. So in socialism, it becomes the instrument of the workers. Ready now? Is the words. It becomes the instrument of the proletariat. It becomes a, ready? Dictatorship of the proletariat. You heard that? That arises in Lenin's work. So, capitalism is, for Mr. Lenin, a dictatorship of the capitalists. Socialism is a dictatorship of the workers. Now, I gotta do something here. There is a terrible, terrible confusion in the literature to this day of this dictatorship business. It's just a freaking mess. I'm going to try and correct it if I can. It's just, I don't know why it's continued for the past. What Lenin means by dictatorship is power. So, power is a synonym for dictatorship. So, I'm going to redo it now. Capitalism is the power of the capitalists. Socialism is the power of the workers. But now, here's the nuance. For Lenin, power can have a variety of different forms. So, in capitalism, you can have a dictatorship of the capitalists, but you can have a democratic organization of power. You can't confuse or conflate dictatorship with the kind of power that's organized in society. Those are two different things. So what he means then by dictatorship, unfortunately we use that word, dictatorship is just power. So power of the capitalists can be either in the form of democratic democracy, as we have in the United States, or it could be a autocrat, as in Nazi Germany. In both cases, you have a dictatorship of the capitalists, but the dictatorship takes very different forms. It takes the power takes the form of democracy in the states, and it takes the form of a dictator, an autocrat, in the case of the former Nazi Germany. By the same token, in socialism, you would have power forwarded by the proletariat, the workers, but that could take a variety of different forms. That could take the form of parliamentary democracy, or it could take the form of some tyrant. That's first step one. Step two. Power over what? Dictatorship over what? What's the object of this? Okay, these two different kinds of societies. For Lenin, it's over class exploitation. Very clear. This differentiates him from Bernstein. Bernstein is really not clear. But for Mr. Lenin, he wants the workers to have the power, whether it be in whatever the kind of political organization judges for democracy, but whatever it is, he wants power in the hands of workers to create a freedom from class exploitation. So the power of the state is used to get rid of class exploitation. Criticism. For Mr. Lenin, the state is never understood to have any kind of independence of its own. It's always an instrument of either the workers, socialism, or the capitalism. So he falls into this kind of economic determinism. He's a structuralist. And there he differs dramatically from Bernstein. In Bernstein, the state does have a relative autonomy. Next step. Socialism for Mr. Lenin is called the first stage of communism. So I'm picking up now this reading that I'm not lecturing on, but I'm not going to do it, this critique of the Gaza program by Marx, which is on your reading list, but I'm going to talk about that. In socialism, there are two stages. The first stage of socialism is called the first stage of communism. So the first stage of communism is what he labels as socialism. Here, in this first stage of socialism, the second stage is called the full development of communism. So in this first stage of socialism, we have the collectivization of means of production. We have the institution of planning. So we've accomplished this radically altering of the mode of production. So he's swallowing all these guys, swallowing Mr. Engels on this. We have socialized ownership of the means of production and planning. But the problem is, in this first stage of communism, socialism, the wealth in society that's produced with socialized forces and socialized ownership and planning, the wealth is distributed on the basis of, I quote, bourgeois rights. And a state is needed in the first stage because of this distribution problem, not because of the ownership or market problem. So it's a little complex. The proletariat rises up, captures the state in some revolutionary event, like the Soviet Union. First thing it does is radically alter the mode of production by collectivizing the relation, getting rid of private property of the means of production, instituting planning, getting rid of private markets. Then the state becomes in order for the workers to do that, they control the state. That's what they rise up. They make a revolution. They control the state. That's the first two things they do. So the state becomes the instrument of the workers, dictatorship of the proletariat. So what the hell do you need a state for? Why should the state continue? The state has to continue despite accomplishing these two major things because the wealth that's being now produced in socialism, this first stage of communism, is being distributed to the people on the basis of equal pay for equal work. And he calls that a bourgeois, a capitalist right. So in socialism, he says, the first stage, wealth is distributed on the basis of what socialized labor contributes to production. So exploitation has ended, according to him. He deduces the absence of exploitation from the collectivization of relations and institution of planning. Like all these others, he deduces that. Exploitation is ended. But we still have problems in society because of the distribution problem, how the consumption problem is solved. That is, people are being paid equal pay for equal work. They're not being paid according to need. I quote, they're being paid according to work performed, but not according to need. And he says that being paid according to work is a bourgeois right. It's not a communist right. Full communism, that's the second stage. So full communism is your second stage. We don't have socialism anymore. We have full communism is, ready now, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's Marx. So if I ask you that on the exam, this is Mr. Lenin and Mr. Marx. The famous quote by Marx from that critique of the God program is from each according to his ability, to each according to his, you get paid whatever you need under the second stage. So That's a utopian vision. Let's examine that. So Lenin distinguishes then between this first stage of ownership, collective ownership, and this distribution of the wealth that's being produced in determining whether or not we have full communism. A state is necessary in this first stage, in socialism, this first stage of communism, once again, because we need a state to deal with the distribution problems that arise. This distribution problem produces inequality in society, and the stress and strain and the arguments on the basis of this bourgeois right that people get paid according to the work that they perform, equal pay for equal work. So he says, look, that doesn't take into account our different needs in society. What does he mean? Well, we have different needs. We have different family size. We have different medical needs. We have different health differences, and therefore different medical needs, different family size. Some people have a lot of children, some people don't. We have difficulties of labor that doesn't take into account the differences between a coal miner and a cop, policeman, policewoman, and an MD, doctor of medicine. Does everybody get paid the same pay for 40 hours of work? Does that take into account the different stresses and strains in these different occupations? Does it take into account environmental differences? Some people work in an environment in which there's a good deal of pollution, and they die early, and the children suffer. Should that be taken into account? How do you take that into account? Working in an office is quite different than working in a coal mine. Being a secretary in an office is different than being a cop and risking your life during the workday. Being an MD has all the stresses and strains of making decisions on people's lives. The highest incidence of drugs and alcohol in the United States is by MDs. That occupation has because it's so stressful. Differences of age, differences of size of people, strength. How do you take all that into account if everybody gets paid the same? So he says, that's not what we want. What we want in a society is which we can allow everybody to receive whatever they need. And when that happens, we no longer need the state. Because the tension that exists in the first stage, in which we have the distribution, not taking into account these dramatically different needs, that's why we need the state, because of the tensions. That's going to disappear. People get paid on the basis of need, and here's your famous line. In the second stage, the state will wither away. This is called the withering away of the state. It'll wither away because that tension no longer will arise in society because everybody can get whatever they need. Now, the last part is real easy, okay, to get this view. Follows the logic of the course. What's his economics? How can the society ever produce enough wealth to distribute on the basis of need? So I see the smirks on some of their faces, but you're going to fail the exam. It's not that I disagree with you, but what you need is the logic of Mr. Engels and Mr. Kautsky and Mr. Bernstein to answer this question of Lenin, and it's very important because this is what was tried in the Soviet Union in the first few years of China and East European countries.
Okay, I think it's because it would work if the producers communicate with the consumers.
Almost there. That's very close. Yeah, man.
Those who collectively produce, distribute what they produce.
Almost. But let's go back to Mr. Engels. Make sure we get his argument. So it fits together as a puzzle, and then we can understand what happened in the 20th century better. Remember, so Mr. Engels, he gets this from Marx, and Marx and Engels, and I put it on the blackboard. In capitalism, which is extraordinarily progressive, so all these characters will never indict capitalism for a lack of innovation, for a lack of production. No way. Capitalism is progressive. Forget the feudalism, slavery, and so forth. You're never going to get an indictment. The productivity of labor, as I showed you, rises in the United States. The problem arises is that they connect the progressive development of the forces of production to an antiquated and backward set of relations of production. The problem with the development of the forces and the great wealth that's produced is that it's constrained by private property. The markets. That's that tableau I gave you in the blackboard. I asked you that question. So every firm has the right to withhold production, and it must withhold production if it's going to survive when the profit rate falls. Hence, the first stage of socialism, the first stage of communism, socialism, is when we collectivize the relations of production, and we just said, we collectivize markets, and that will unleash the forces of production. They're no longer constrained. So the socialized relations have brought into a perfect harmony, a balance with the socialized forces, and those forces then can grow, develop, and resume their progressive nature, business cycles in. And hence capital, no longer capitalism, but industry is capable of producing an enormous amount of wealth. It's basically unlimited, which then can be distributed on the basis of need, and you don't need to serve. That's their image. It would be akin to what happened during World War II in the United States. There was that magic period of time after Pearl Harbor, roughly 41 to 45, in which the industrial might of the United States was unleashed under tremendous state controls. So there the state intervened with who owned what and how in markets. The state instituted planning, allocated labor in a variety of ways. The state did it under FDR. And the result was, in a very short period of time, the United States was able to pour out of its factories the airplanes, the tanks, the weapons, blah, 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 to defeat two major industrial powers in different parts of the world. And people marveled. The Nazis and the Japanese, they couldn't get over what happened in a short period of time. This cowboy nation, the United States, was producing more airplanes, more artillery pieces, more rifles than those two countries combined, tenfold, 20-fold what they could produce. That's the image. But it wouldn't be military equipment, it would be consumer goods. Think of what the United States is capable of producing according to the image, if it could reach its potential. So that's what the idea is by Mr. Lenin, or in his case would be for Russia, or the Soviet Union, or any capitalist nation becomes socialized. So you unleash the forces of production, and you allow the forces of production to resume their march forward, which produces this enormous wealth, which we can distribute on the basis of need. So Lenin then views this first stage, okay, which is necessary to the second stage. So the second stage is what they're striving for. That's the utopian image. In this first stage, we would have then collective ownership of the means of production and state planning, and state administration of all markets. Number one. Number two, we still have the bourgeois distribution of consumption on the basis of work performed. So in the Soviet Union and in the other countries, we have equal wages for equal work. Third, society is one large state factory and office, again, with equal pay for equal work. House behavior. And then the state, number four, is under the control of a vanguard of the workers. The workers have a representative in the state for their interests, and their interests alone, a communist party. And that function of the Communist Party is just one of administration and accounting, according to Lenin. These four conditions were established in the Soviet Union, China, up until 10 years ago, Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, Poland, Hungary, every East European country, East Germany, and so forth. So what I just described to you was the functioning socialism at one time in 50% of the world's population after World War II. So it's a direct reflection, not so much of Bernstein. Bernstein is more Western Europe. It's a reflection of what Kautsky, Engels, and Marx had established, but much more than Marx, really Kautsky and Engels and Kautsky. And Lenin, and Lenin. Okay, you ready? Here is the question for Mr. Lenin and Kautsky and the rest of these characters, and Engels. This is a vision of socialism I just presented to you. And again, it's a different one from Bernstein, it's different from the utopian socialists we already confronted. Here's a question about that vision. Which is, who in these societies, Cuba, former Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cuba today, and so forth, who in those societies actually receive the surplus labor that's produced by the workers in the farms and factories? That was Marx's question. That's the one question I introduced you to. What these individuals have done is as follows. They answered that question by answering who owned the means of production and who controlled the market. They deduced the absence of exploitation from the presence of collective ownership of the means of production and planning. Presence of planning. There's no reason in the world to make that kind of deduction. Those are two different things. And you can't deduce one from the other. In other words, it's quite possible to have collective ownership of the means of production and planning and still have class exploitation. That's what's haunted each one of these countries right up until the present. It's quite possible in Cuba, the former Soviet Union, to collectivize the means of production, to institute planning, and still have a small group of state officials, a vanguard, who appropriate the profits on the farms and the factories and distribute them in a variety of different ways. And that presence of class exploitation, which these other theorists say is not present, that presence of class exploitation can eat away and erode these so-called socialist societies. So that's our next step. The next step is to deal with that particular question. Okay? So that's your next reading on your reading list. Finish Mr. Lenin and then go to the next one, which is this class theory society that I have assigned to you in the part B of the reading list. Okay, I shall see you on